Which desktop UI should I use? Is the latest one the best one? Is WinForms dead? Aren't console applications super old technology? These are all questions I get on a weekly basis. So I thought I'd take some time and walk through the four major options for desktop applications in C#. We'll discuss the benefits and drawbacks of each UI, and then we'll discuss the future. One of these platforms is finally dying, and it probably isn't the one you think. Now, before we get started, if you're new to my channel, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. Whether you're new to C# or have used it for years, you should be able to find something here that will benefit you. Now, if you're interested in getting course discounts and other perks, sign up for my mailing list. The link is in the description. Also, make sure you subscribe to this channel so you can get alerted when I post new content. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday, with occasional bonus videos beyond that. Okay, so let's get started. Now, normally this is the point where I jump into some code, but first we're going to take a step back and actually go through a PowerPoint deck, which is unusual for me. But I thought that for illustrating this purpose and for me talking it through, it's probably better for you to see what I'm talking about in written form. So let's start with this grid here. So we're going to talk through the four major desktop UIs: console, WinForm, WPF, and UWP. We're going to talk about the purpose of each one of them, what the thought process was behind when it was created, and then even going forward now, what the thought process is as to why it exists. We're going to talk through the benefits. Each of the four has benefits, even today. And then also the drawbacks as well, because each of the four have drawbacks. So let's get started with console application first. It's the one that is often skipped over as even a UI at all. So let's talk through what's the purpose of a console application. And the primary purpose for a console application is automation. A console application is designed primarily to be able to be run where it runs and ends, And that's why we have to actually stop it from ending by putting a console read line or a console read key at the end of our application. Otherwise, it just exits the application. The reason for that is because console applications were designed to be run by other applications. Whether it be a service or whether it be a task scheduler or a batch script or something like that, that's what console applications were designed for. They're really a powerhouse when it comes to getting things done. You can do a lot of stuff in PowerShell or in batch scripts, or even you used to do VB scripts. But if you want to get some real large scale things done, there's no better way of doing it than writing a C# application and then just executing it on a batch schedule. So C# has the full power of reading from a database and reading from APIs and from other sources and writing to the database or sending out information, emailing. All this stuff you can do from a C# application, and then you wrap it in a console where it just reports what it did and then it shuts down. So it can be scheduled to run a lot. Maybe once a night, maybe every hour, maybe every minute. Okay, so that's the purpose of a console application. Now, what are the benefits? Well, it's quick and simple. You can develop a console application in no time at all. I mean, when you start it up, you write one line of code and you're done if you want to be. So it's pretty quick and simple. It's stable. Console applications have been around for a long time, and there's not much that can go wrong with them. I mean, it just works. And that's really powerful, especially for automation, because we don't want to have something that fails on us just trying to get started. Now, this third benefit is one that people don't necessarily see at first, and this is one that I love, and that is it's great for testing. So when you want to try out a little piece of C# code, create a console application because it's so quick to start. You don't have to worry about naming things right and dragging and dropping things in the form even. It's already ready to go to start testing some code. And finally, this is one that is newer, is that the console application is actually cross-platform. It's the only UI on this list that is cross-platform. Now, others have .NET Core 3 support, but they're not cross-platform. What I mean by cross-platform is a console application can run on Windows, it can run on Linux, and it can run on Mac, as long as it's a .NET Core console application. So it can run on any desktop operating system. So that's a huge benefit to console applications. Now, what are the drawbacks? They're not viable for regular users. Okay, so a console application is great for what it does. It's automation, and that's what it does. But if you want to give users like data entry, that's just not what console applications do well. They can do it. In our test applications, we build them all the time. But users want to see a form to fill out. They don't want to see this command line type prompt. That's not what works well for them. So it's definitely not something you want to put in front of general users. Now, obviously, system administrators or other tech-savvy people, perfect. It works. But not for the regular public. So let's talk through WinForms. WinForms was originally the original user interface for .NET. Before that, even, it was the user interface for VB, Visual Basic. So VB6 is what I started developing in professionally. Well, we had a designer that looks a lot like our WinForm designer today. It was drag and drop, and we designed forms that way, and we call ourselves developers. Not quite the same developing level we do today, but that's the original user interface. But it was designed from the ground up to be a rapid application development. Okay, so rapid application development. And that's what it's for. You can drag and drop buttons and text boxes and text blocks and other things onto the form really quickly and get a form up and running in front of your C# code in minutes. I mean, it is a very quick way of developing user interfaces. So that was its design. So the benefits of WinForm applications. They're quick and easy. Kind of like console applications, not quite as quick and easy as consoles, but at the same time, for that user experience, for the regular users, you want to have something a little more GUI driven. Well, this is as quick and as easy as you can get. Now, this next one, people tend to forget about. They're still widely used. And people say, oh, it's dead technology. No one's using WinForms anymore. And when it comes to new development, probably. Okay? So when it comes to developing, if you don't have any C# applications, typically you don't start with a new WinForm application at a company. However, there are an enormous amount of companies that still use WinForm applications as their primary application, which means they're also doing new WinForm application development because they're adding on to their existing platform. Now, hopefully they're starting to transition over, but the reality is there's still a large group of people using VB6. And the reason for this is because a large company that invests hundreds of thousands of dollars into an application that works for them can't just say, let's scrap it, develop a new application for the next 3 years, and it's going to a new platform. That just doesn't happen that way. Now, there are ways to move forward with WinForms, but it's still widely used. So don't forget that when you're talking about learning a user interface. If you want to work for a company, there's a decent chance you'll use WinForms. Okay, I'm not going to say a good chance because with the web and with there's different sizes of companies, but large companies especially, WinForms is still going to be prevalent. Okay? And the last one, and this is why it's still relied on, is because it is reliable. WinForms has been around for a very long time. It has been built upon and built upon and built upon. And a lot of those early bugs that come to these other platforms aren't in WinForms anymore simply because WinForms has been around for so long. Now, there is the other side of that, which is it's been around for so long that it's starting to find bugs the other side of it, which is newer things come along and WinForms might not be able to respond as well. But WinForms is still a very, very stable platform. So the drawbacks. First of all, it's CPU bound. What I mean by that is that whenever you draw anything on a screen, so whether it's the form itself, whether you're showing an image or a video or anything else, it all runs through your CPU, not your GPU. Okay, so your CPU is your processor, your central processor, whereas your GPU is your graphics card. So with WinForms, you can't use your graphics card. It's not able to access that typically. Now, there are ways to try and trick certain things in order to use a graphics card, but I'm talking in general, WinForms doesn't use your graphics card. So therefore, it's going to bog your computer down even though the computer has more resources to give. The other thing is it's hard to scale. What I mean by scale is not making a bigger application, it's making the form larger or smaller. By default, how WinForms works is it defines a grid on your screen. So if you have 1920 by 1080 pixels on your screen, that's how it will define basically that same grid if you were to maximize it. You have that same grid where it starts up at 0, 0, and it goes all the way up to 1919 to 1079. So you're zero based. So when it comes to, if you move to a different monitor, if that monitor only has, 640 by 480, which no one has anymore, but let's say that size, well, your form was designed for a much larger screen. It won't just shrink to fit that screen. It will just not, you'll only see a part of that. And that used to be a really big problem because it used to be that monitors were all different sizes. And so you'd have to develop for that 640 by 480 screen because even if you had a 1024 by 768 screen, you couldn't use all that real estate because somebody else might have that smaller screen. And it doesn't resize well. Now there are some workarounds and some scaling you can kind of do, but there is a lot of bugs that come along with that. It's essentially trying to redo how WinForms works, and it's not ideal. What they're doing behind the scenes is basically saying, okay, if you're on this size screen, I'm going to give you 10 pixels for this button. But if you're on a little bit larger screen, I'll give you 12 pixels for that same button. And so it draws the coordinates different. But that doesn't always work real well. There's some problems that come along with that. So that's still a problem to work through, and it's clunky. Okay? So there's some definite downsides to WinForms. Let's talk through WPF. What's its purpose? Well, Microsoft came about and said, you know what? WinForms has its limitations. We want to change how we do user interfaces to harness the power of these modern machines. When WPF first came about, graphics cards were they were there, but it wasn't like everybody had this really powerful graphics card, but everyone had a graphics card. Before that, when WinForms came about, we didn't really have dedicated graphics cards. They were all on board. Well, with WPF, we actually had graphics cards to start using. And so Microsoft said, we're going to take advantage of that. And they wanted to create, basically, let's throw out WinForms and let's build this new cutting-edge, powerful user interface that can do amazing things. And oh, by the way, it's not going to be bound to the CPU. It's not going to be hard to scale. Notice those two drawbacks for WinForms. Those were two that they really targeted for WPF to try and kill. So, what they create? Well, first of all, it's DirectX powered, meaning it has access to that graphics card. So when you render something in WPF, it can actually use your GPU, not just your CPU. That makes your applications run faster. It makes for WPF can do a lot more graphic intensive stuff, like you can make a button bounce around or pulse and grow and shrink. All that kind of stuff can work because you have access to those additional resources. With that came a modern design. WPF allows for a lot more things. For example, maybe a simple one, but it's revolutionary compared to WinForms, is that WPF allowed gradient backgrounds. The idea that one color could change into another over a distance. Those kind of things were not something that WinForms could do, but WPF can just do it naturally. So you can have some really pretty looking modern user interfaces. They also built in the idea of binding for pretty much everything. And with that came an easy support for things like MVVM, so that you could disconnect your code directly from your view. And that's where those design patterns can really come into play. Now, WinForms, let's back up one, the code behind is really tightly attached to the user interface itself. In fact, it's the same class. If you actually look at the class, it's a partial class. Part of it is your code behind, part of it is your designing or drawing the user interface. Now, people have tried to kind of backfill in some disconnected architectures in WinForms to greater or lesser extent, but it really is a patch on top of something it was not designed for. WPF, out of the box, designed for these disconnected architectures that allow for better modern development when it comes to things like MVVM. And then finally, WPF has this really interesting concept where you can separate out the user interface design from the code design. Now, part of that is that MVVM, the bindings, and part of it is the focus on that modern design. What this allows you to do is you could actually have a dedicated WPF form designer who didn't really know much, if any, C# code. And they can work on the same project at the same time on the front end of WPF, whereas you can work on the back end in the C#, and those two will just work together. Microsoft even created a tool they give away called Blend, which its job was to do the user interface side of WPF, the designer side. So you actually have a separate tool that is more focused on, okay, putting animations in, or let's do a gradient here, or let's, reskin how this works. And all of that was designed so that you can have those separations and your team could work on different pieces at the same time and have a really great and rich environment to do it. So those are the benefits of WPF. What are the drawbacks? Well, number one is slow development. So in the previous two, Console and WinForm, the focus was on getting developers to get applications out the door quickly. With WPF, the focus was on power and that rich experience and the rich UI. And so what that did was you only have so much you can work with. You've got to kind of balance these scales. And so when they tipped towards that modern design with all the support for designers and separation and all the rest, they put all that effort over there, which tipped the scales against rapid application development. And so it kind of slows down your development when you're building a WPF application. Now, with that comes the idea you have to learn XAML. So that's the UI markup that allows you to design your front end. And XAML, quite frankly, can be confusing. First of all, it's very, very wordy. And that's a problem with XML in general. And of course, XAML is just it's XML for applications, essentially. And so it can be confusing. You have to learn one more thing. And finally, and this is the one that Microsoft often struggles with is they want to give us so many options, so many different ways we can do things, and so much power that it's just overwhelming. The amount of things you can do means you often don't do most of them. If you've ever seen a gradient and how it actually looks, or a real, not just one, but like a staged gradient, it takes up 5, 10, 15, 20 lines of XAML to define that gradient. And that might just be on one small box, not in the whole UI. And so you can get, when you're talking a real UI for a company, or for an application, it's going to look great when it comes to the animations and the color schemes and how things work. You might have 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 lines of XAML for one form. That's incredibly huge. And it's very, very difficult to understand what's going on. So WPF, well, it has a ton of power and it has a ton of features. With all that power comes option overload. And that can cause some negative backlash when it comes to developing WPF applications. The biggest one that I see, though, is slowness. The idea that you can't just crank out a WPF app nearly as fast as you can these other UIs so far. Okay? So those are the three that people normally know about. This last one is one that is more modern. It came around with Windows 8. And people aren't quite sure what it is. And the biggest thing I get is this replacing WPF? So let's talk through it. UWP stands for Universal Windows Platform, I believe. And the idea behind it was Microsoft wanted one universal application that could be run anywhere. So write it once, run it anywhere. Now, the original idea was, in Microsoft's mind, anywhere meant anywhere on a Windows-style platform, anywhere on Microsoft platform. And so that anywhere was your Windows 8 machine at the time. Now, this is back in the WinRT days. This is pre-UWP. So Windows 8 and Windows Phone, which is now defunct, and Xbox. Now, the idea was it would go to all these different platforms. They even had a version of Windows that was a Windows RT installation, meaning they would only run applications that were designed in the Windows RT infrastructure or design. It wouldn't run our typical Win32 application, which is a WPF application, a console application, or a WinForm application. It wouldn't run any of those. It only run UWP applications. Now, I say it's actually WinRT, sorry. So WinRT came with Windows 8. And then Windows 8.1, they upgraded it. And then with Windows 10, they went to UWP, which is, again, their attempt to kind of rebrand it a little bit, bring some more things in, make it a little more universal, still trying to get that Windows Phone integration in. And the design was, let's have this thing that we can just run everywhere. This is in the days when Microsoft was still trying to rule the world by owning everything. And they were trying to say, we're not going to talk to anybody else, but we'll own the entire stack. These days have changed. Okay? So let's talk through the benefits and drawbacks first, and we'll talk through where we are today. So the benefits of UWP applications, they're sandboxed, meaning they don't have access to the system resources directly without asking for them. And even then, there's some restrictions around it. So think about your applications on your phone. When you get a new application, let's just say it has to use your photos. Anymore, An application doesn't get access to your photos directly, not at first. It has to pop a box up and say, will you allow me access to your photos? And you say yes or no. And if you say yes, then it has access to your photos, but not until then. UWP applications work in a very, very similar manner. You have to create a manifest and say, these are the things that I want to give access to. The camera, your email, your photos, your files. And if you don't ask for access for them, you don't get access for them. And so the sandbox idea was, we're going to protect your computer from these applications so you can feel more comfortable downloading an application that's a UWP application because it doesn't have any access that you don't give it. Okay? So that's the first benefit. The second benefit is the Microsoft Store. So UWP applications, by default, the way they're distributed is that you actually package them up and sell them or give them away for free in the Windows Store, which is installed on every Windows 10 machine. So that you're already on every machine, well, seemingly, on the planet, it seems like. Okay? Not true. But you're on every Windows 10 machine on the planet. And so, with very little effort, you can get your application sold to hundreds of thousands of people. And because it is a store, you can actually sell it, and you can use Microsoft to do the selling. Therefore, they just take a cut, just like you would for an iOS app in the App Store or an Android app in the App Store. This is the same kind of thing. And so it's very easy to get your application to market. Unlike WPF applications or WinForm applications or console applications. Those are much more difficult to get to market. There's not a built-in Microsoft strategy to do that. With UWP, it's out of the box. That's the first thing they think about is getting your application to market. So it's built right in. And also at UWP, there's very, very clear standards. They have style guides from Microsoft that says, this is what a UWP application should look like. And so it's very clear and very easy to follow, and therefore it's easier to design an application because you have these kind of guidelines to fit in order to fit into the mold that they developed. So those are the benefits. Let's talk through the drawbacks. Number one is not an accidental entry. It's a negative as well to be sandboxed. Being sandboxed means you're limited. If the user doesn't give you access to the photos, you don't have access to photos. You're done. So if you're a photo application and you don't have access to photos, it stinks. Now, you also have the restrictions of you can't just do things that you're used to with WinForms or WPF or console applications. You can't just write to the hard drive. It's not that simple. There's a lot of things where you'll find it's not that simple is the answer. The other thing, the second entry, difficult to distribute. You may say, wait, store distribution is built right in. That's easy. And yes, that's true. But the downside is store distribution is pretty much the only way to distribute a UWP application. Think that one through. If you want to build an application to work on just your machine or yours and your wife's machine or something like that, it's much more difficult to do that. In fact, what you have to do is you have to do what's called side loading, which means you actually take down the walls or make your PC less protected in order to run applications outside of the Microsoft Store. And that's pretty much, it's either on or it's off. And so it's much less safe to do that. Now, it's not unsafe, but it's less safe. And that's just to run your own application. And the other thing is, and this is a real kicker, UWP applications were designed to be universal, but they only work on Windows 10 for desktop operating systems. Not Windows 8, not Windows 8.1, not Windows 7. They work on Windows 10. And even then, they might not work on your version of Windows 10 if you haven't been updating with the Windows updates. Now, most of us do because it's on automatically. But that can be a problem because not everybody is on Windows 10. And in fact, I would say the majority of the world is not on Windows 10. Especially businesses find it very difficult to upgrade their operating system because it changes the compatibility of their applications. So they can't just update whenever there's an update. Well, that means that your audience is actually very, very small when it comes to UWP applications. Your target audience is only Windows 10 users. And if you want to have access to all the APIs, you'll have to target only Windows 10 users who have been doing their regular Windows updates. Now, they will work on Xbox as well, and that can be a big bonus. However, most of the time, people who are building desktop applications don't really need their desktop application on the Xbox. Now, if you're building a game, then yes, it's kind of cool that it works on Windows 10 and the Xbox. Awesome. But for most of us, that's not really a big appeal. It sounds cool. I can run my application on the Xbox. Sure, but will you? I mean, if you're doing data entry, the Xbox is not the platform for that. So that's the grid of these 4 desktop applications: console, WinForm, WPF, and UWP. Let's talk through the future. And there's a couple things in here that might be a little surprising. The first one let's talk about is .NET Core and the future of these 4 different UIs. My guess, and this is a guess, is not set in stone, but my guess is the first user interface to drop off this list and no longer be supported or no longer be used as heavily or featured at all is actually the latest one, UWP. It is the least useful user interface of the 4. Now, a lot of you have told me or heard that WinForms is dead because WinForms is so old. It came out in 2001, 2002 with the original .NET, and therefore it's dead. I've heard people say even years ago that Microsoft is no longer investing in WinForms. And that's really not true. Now, WPF does replace WinForms in the fact that it is a more modern user interface. However, WinForms still has its place because it's still quick and easy to develop, it's still widely used, and it's still reliable. Microsoft has reaffirmed that WinForm and WPF are both their modern platform in the .NET Core 3 release, which comes out probably around this August. In it, they have moved WPF and WinForm, the backend code, over to .NET Core. This does not mean that they'll be cross-platform. Don't confuse that. WinForm and WPF will not be cross-platform user interfaces. Probably ever. In fact, if Microsoft were to say we're going to make them cross-platform, I'd be very, very hesitant to move forward with them. And the reason why is because both WinForm and WPF are tied tightly to the Windows APIs. Things that, the GDI and the HWind and things that are buried very, very deep into the core of Windows. Replacing those with a mechanism for going cross-platform really isn't the way forward. It'd basically be ripping most of the guts of both of them out and replacing them. Currently, it looks like the way forward will probably be with Xamarin. Now, I haven't included Xamarin on here because primarily it's a mobile application development, mobile UIs, not desktop UIs. But I think we'll see more and more development coming out of that may focus on desktop, maybe working with a mono group or something like that. But right now, it's not a great story for user interfaces on Mac or Linux from .NET. So, WinForm is getting a .NET Core 3.0 upgrade, and so is WPF. Why are they doing this if it's not cross-platform? The reason why is because .NET Core is the new .NET. And in fact, if you've heard about .NET 5, which is where they merge all these different .NETs together, that's really what it is. It's a part of. Xamarin and .NET Core are pretty close as far as their back end. And the one outlier was the .NET framework. The idea that it just couldn't move over. It couldn't be upgraded to the point of moving over into a cross-platform type environment. Plus, it's bringing a whole lot of baggage from earlier days of .NET. Remember that .NET 4.8, which is the latest version, and actually the last major version of the .NET framework. Remember that's 4.8. Originally is 1.0, and then 2.0, and then I think 3 and 3.5, and 4.5, and 4.6, and 4.7, and 4.8. So, and I may have missed a few versions in there, but there's a lot of major changes. 4 major, really 5 or 6, probably 5 major changes in there to get us to 4.8. That's a lot of history. That's over a decade, almost 2, of changes. Well, we couldn't bring those over. I say we. Microsoft couldn't bring those over into a cross-platform environment and bring all that baggage with them. And so they kind of went back to the drawing board and redid .NET. Kind of started over a little bit and said, let's build something from the ground up that's designed to be a modern replacement for .NET framework. They came up with .NET Core, and they also brought about the .NET Standard, which allowed them to help create an interface that the .NET Core, even .NET Framework, and Xamarin could all use to point to their different APIs. And so this project came along that allowed them to start seeing how we can bring these similar things together. And .NET Standard kind of was an interface that allowed them behind the scenes to call different APIs for the same task depending on which platform you're on. But we're getting to the point where those 3 languages, which now is .NET Core and Xamarin really, those now 2 can merge together into one in .NET 5. And so that's the direction going forward. But remember I said that there's not really a great story for desktop development in Mac and Linux. Well, if WinForm and WPF, which are .NET Framework based, if they were still .NET Framework, they'd be left out of the cold as well. Which means that there would be no user interface except the console application, which I love the console application, but notice its drawback. Not viable for regular users. You just can't do that. And so in order to move forward, Microsoft had to have user interfaces for their code. And so WPF and WinForm both are still viable, still powerful user interfaces. Now, to me, this shows the fact that WinForms and WPF are both .NET Core 3. This shows Microsoft's commitment to these user interfaces. Now, going forward, one of the cool things is you can take a WinForm application, and I'll be doing this in a future video. You take a WinForm application and port it from .NET Framework over to .NET Core 3. So a WinForm application that we called old-fashioned and old and whatever else can run in .NET Core 3, and you'll almost immediately see major speed changes because .NET Core runs much faster than .NET Framework. So with no other changes, you can actually have your WinForm application run faster. They can do the same thing with WPF. So that allows companies who have invested lots of time and effort into these platforms to move forward with them without having to lose that investment or having to redo that application. They can actually get the benefits of a modern platform without having to sacrifice the months or even years it would take to rebuild their applications from scratch. So, we talked about console, the fact that it's already cross-platform. WinForm and WPF are going to be at least .NET Core 3, not cross-platform, but not .NET Core 3. And I said that UWP is probably the one that's on its way out. And here's why I say that. Right now, UWP is still .NET Framework. And I haven't heard much talk about changing that. Now, they may, but right now it's still .NET Framework. Now, before you panic, .NET Framework is here for a long time yet. We're talking years of support. Now, there's not going to be a new major version. 4.8 was the last major version of the .NET Framework. What that means is just that they won't be investing new resources into creating new things to do in the .NET Framework. That doesn't mean that the .NET Framework stops working. It's going to still have security fixes and bug fixes. It just won't get some of the new shiny stuff that the rest of the .NET Core ecosystem will. Which means that the years and years and years of investment in .NET Framework isn't wasted. It will still move forward. And it will be years of support yet. I believe it's like 5 or 10, I think it's 10 more years, but I'm not positive, don't quote me on that, of support for the .NET Framework. It's been a long time. Because think about it, Microsoft's customers are still on WinForms. There's still customers on VB6. So Microsoft doesn't want to tell their customers, yeah, get off. Because they know that's not necessarily possible. They want to provide an easy on-ramp, like with WinForms, to move to a modern platform. And that does give them more freedom to say it's time because you can move over, but they can't just, flip of a switch, say we're done. Now, they've done it in the past. I mean, Silverlight customers are probably still a little bitter about what happened with Silverlight, and I understand that. But they do want to support this in a longer-term manner. So with that being said, UWP applications are still .NET Framework, and I haven't heard much talk about .NET Core for them. The other thing is, it used to be that if you wanted some of the really cool API stuff, you'd go to UWP applications because they had the coolest toys when it came to talking to the operating system, more than even WPF did. Well, now Microsoft has developed this idea of XAML islands. And here's what that means. And this is one of the frustrating parts about XAML, is that XAML is different depending on which version you're using. UWP XAML is different than WPF XAML. You can't just interchange the two. It doesn't work. And so there were certain things in UWP XAML that you didn't have access to anywhere else. Well, now Microsoft has said you can build it in UWP, in the UWP XAML, and then use that control. Whatever you create, that control of that item, you can use it in WPF or WinForms. You can use it in either one. And so even WinForms can have some really cool UWP style GPU using controls in a WinForm application, which I think is amazing. And so they call them XAML islands. The idea is you bring this whole island of stuff, it's self-contained, into these other user interfaces. And what that does is it removes some of the positives from UWP. The powerful pieces that it had access to that no one else did are now coming to these other platforms. The other thing that's difficult, or that is a harbinger of, I don't want to say doom, but it kind of is for UWP, is the fact that it used to be that the Microsoft Store only allowed UWP applications. They have changed that. Now we can put Win32 applications, which would be WinForm applications, console applications, WPF applications. We can put those in the Windows Store, or the Microsoft Store. That means that UWP is not the only one that can go to the Microsoft Store. Therefore, that's another thing that was only for UWP that's now for all of the user interfaces. So we're starting to lose all the benefits of UWP, and there's not really a reason as much to go to UWP. So that's why I see UWP is being in decline. People aren't adopting it. It's hard. The sandbox mode is difficult. The fact that the Microsoft Store, while it is on so many computers, isn't used nearly as much. These are reasons why UWP wasn't adopted, and in turn, why Microsoft isn't investing tons of resources into making it better, because it's just not what people are using. Now, Microsoft, in the old days, used to be very self-focused. They wanted everything to run on their platform, and UWP was kind of one of those things. The idea was, and I did like the idea. The idea was write once, run anywhere. And their idea of anywhere was anywhere that is a Microsoft product. But at the same time, most of these products, these platforms, don't talk to each other. I used to have an Apple ecosystem. So I had a MacBook, I had the wireless Mac, I think it's the Airport. I had an Apple TV, and all these different things talk to each other very, very nice, and it worked great. And the reason why I had all Apple products is because the only thing that would talk to them were Apple products. Now, our ecosystems kind of have opened up a little bit, and Microsoft is actually leading the charge and saying, you know what? We can play nice with others. And I know that's shocking, because this is not the Microsoft of old. Microsoft of even a decade ago was not like this. Now, you can actually have Linux run on your Windows machine. You can use the Linux command line right from Windows. When you're building Docker applications, you can actually build Linux Docker applications on Windows. And guess what? Not only does Microsoft allow it, they encourage it. And the same way here, Microsoft has looked at the marketplace and said, there's a really cool company that is building some neat things for the iPhone and for Android. And they're called Xamarin. And so they bought that platform, they bought that company, but they didn't buy it and crush it. They bought it and integrated it into their ecosystem. They made it more accessible. It used to be that some of the tools that you used for Xamarin were quite pricey, and now they're free. They're built into Visual Studio. And they're allowing for a lot more cross-platform and integrations with the other platforms, whether it's Apple platforms, whether it's Google platforms, or whether it's Linux platforms. And the idea of a universal Windows platform user interface just doesn't jive with that new direction. And so I think for all those reasons that UWP is on its way out. So when looking at what to build for user interface, I would, unless you have a very specific case, I would cross that one off your list. And then you have three options: console, WinForm, and WPF. Now, the the idea, the normal thing is what's the latest and greatest, I'm going to use that. And that would be WPF. In a lot of cases, that will be a good option or a good solution. But I would encourage you not to look at it as the only option. For example, if you want to do automation, there is none better than the console application. WinForm applications, WPF applications, you can do automation with them. It's just not going to be as powerful. Console applications almost always, I'd say 99% of the time, are going to be the way to go. Now, if you are building an application quickly and you want to get something out the door quickly, I would encourage you, look at WinForms. I know that it's not the modern UI that you'd want, but it's simpler. And you know what? Simple gets you out the door. You can make something really pretty in WPF, but you're going to spend a lot of time doing it. And you know what? While you're still making your pretty application, somebody else has already built an application and got it to market. So there is something to be said for that rapid application development. So WinForms does have a place still. The other thing is you really should know WinForms because it is still so widely used. So I also wouldn't turn it down for that reason. However, with that being said, I still would default to WPF. Now, I said don't make it your only option, or don't think it's the only option. And that's true. But I would start at WPF and say, do we need to have it out the door fast? Okay, well then WinForms is the option. Do we need to have automation? Well then console's the option. Otherwise, maybe we should look at WPF. And maybe we should make that our platform. It is more complicated though. So you have to balance that. You have to look at your team and say, can we handle the additional complexity? Because if we can't handle the additional complexity, there's no reason to go to WPF. Because you're just going to endanger your platform, your product, your team. Don't do that just because it's more shiny. Now, the next question you might ask is, do I do it in .NET Core or .NET Framework? And again, your first instinct maybe is to say, of course, .NET Core all the way. And in general, you're right, except for a couple things. Right now, WinForms and WPF, .NET Core 3 is not out yet. It's out in preview release. I have it on my machine, but it's not yet complete. And the last thing to be completed, pretty much, is the tooling. Meaning, the WPF designer is in preview, and there is no WinForm designer. So that drag and drop nicety you had with WinForm, and that rapid application development, yeah, it's not there. You have to develop by saying, put this button with the left top corner at in these coordinates. You have to do all that by hand right now, because it's just not there yet. So if you're starting today, or if you're starting soon, and you want to build a WPF or WinForm application, you might not want to go with a .NET Core yet. However, if you're developing your application properly, where you're separating your code from your user interface, which you should be anyways, and I have a couple courses on that if you want to think that one through or look that one through. But if you're developing them separately, as you should, then you build your library in .NET Standard. That way, all your code can be in .NET Standard, and then just a little bit of user interface code will be in .NET Framework. When it comes time to move to .NET Core 3, when it comes out, that transition will be very, very easy because you don't have a whole lot of code to rely on. Now, there may still be some things, and you might want to look into what are the differences and make sure you're trying to stay compatible or as close to compatible as possible. So when that transition comes, it's very quick. But in general, you should be okay with having a .NET Standard library with most of your code and then just your user interface code in .NET Framework. So that's for the WinForm and WPF applications. Console applications, from today on, I would say go .NET Core. .NET Core 2.2 has great stuff in it for console applications. It used to be with .NET Core 1 days where they didn't have all of the libraries available to you. And so there's a lot of things that were missing. Anymore, it's pretty much you have access to everything. There's very, very, very few things that you're missing in .NET Core compared to .NET Framework. Now that brings up something else to think through, and that is your learning itself. So you may have access to a lot of resources that are training you in .NET Framework. In fact, a lot of the videos on this channel are .NET Framework. And so you might say, well, do I have to throw all those away? Or should I only look for modern videos that are .NET Core? And the answer is no. You don't throw away, you don't look for just .NET Core videos, because the differences between .NET Framework and .NET Core are small when it comes to our side, the actual coding side. There are differences, but they're not major differences. They're not about most things. So when you're learning about the solid principles, I have a whole playlist on the solid principles and other principles like that. Well, those were all in .NET Framework. But you know what? Those solid principles still apply. And when you're learning about WPF applications and how to do user interfaces and MVVM, those principles still apply directly. So there's not a lot of stuff, even if statements and for loops and for each and where and all these other things, they still work the same way in both. It's not like you're learning a brand new language. You're learning just small tweaks. So even though something might be a .NET Framework thing, whether it's a tutorial or a video or whatever it is, it still will most likely apply. So just learn about .NET Core, but don't throw out all these great resources because they're not what is currently the platform you're going to. All right, those are the 4 primary desktop user interfaces in C#. Hopefully you've learned a little bit more about what each of them does, what the strengths and weaknesses are, and maybe which one you want to target for your next project or the thing you want to target for your next learning experience. Now, what we didn't cover here was mobile user interfaces. So we didn't cover Xamarin at all. We also didn't cover any web user interfaces, whether it's ASP.NET MVC or Razor Pages or old school web forms or things of that nature, APIs. So this is just for desktop UIs. And we might do a web showdown as well, or maybe web versus desktop. Maybe leave me a comment down below. Let me know if you want to hear about that or have questions about that. Okay, so these are the 4 desktop UIs. Hopefully you've got something to think about and something to kind of point yourself in that direction moving forward. And hopefully this gave you, some good direction to kind of know how to navigate these UIs going forward. All right, thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.